Welcome back to the channel. This is the Earth Science Classroom. This video is on environmental science, and this topic can relate to ecosystems, pollution, both air and water, and biomes. And we're looking at what is dissolved oxygen and what are the factors that control the amount of dissolved oxygen in aquatic environments. This is the Earth Science Classroom. First, oxygen is a naturally occurring gas, O2, in the atmosphere, and it constitutes about 20.8% of the gases or the gas composition of the atmosphere. So 20.8% is oxygen, and this oxygen is produced naturally around the planet and can move between different spheres, from the atmosphere to the hydrosphere to the cryosphere to the biosphere to the geosphere. And when it enters an aquatic environment or a water-based environment, it is dissolved, which means that there's a certain amount of dissolved oxygen within a body of water, in this case a river, a lake, a pond, or an ocean. So we express this amount of dissolved oxygen in milligrams per liter, mg/L, and this refers to the amount of microscopic oxygen bubbles which are dissolved within the water itself, within the complex makeup of the water. In between that is some microscopic oxygen bubbles that are trapped. Now, essentially, this is the balance, or creates a balance in our ecosystems for both the abiotic and biotic components. So the oxygen allows the biotic component, the life part of the ecosystem or the environment, to flourish. So also, we can relate this to BOD, which is the biological oxygen demand, which again is a parameter or a proxy indicator for the health of an environment. And we can study the levels of dissolved oxygen in a body of water to gather information about that ecosystem, about the health of the species, the food webs, the food chains, the energy transfer, and also any changes to that environment. For example, pollution, either point or non-point pollution, and looking at those pollutants that can affect the amount of dissolved oxygen within an ecosystem. Dissolved oxygen is the amount of microscopic oxygen bubbles within a body of water. So the amount in milligrams per liters, and that can fluctuate. But how does it get there in the first place? There's two main sources. First, you have diffusion from the atmosphere, the troposphere, and the oxygen from the atmosphere, which constitutes about 20.8%, is going to diffuse from the atmosphere and flow and move into the body of water through a concentration gradient from the atmosphere to the water. It can become supersaturated, but there is a flow of oxygen into the body of water. And also, we can get oxygen added to the water through photosynthesis of various plant species and algae like seaweed and kelp that are going to be present within the body of water and produce oxygen through photosynthesis, through the combination of CO2, sunlight, to make its own energy as a producer within that food web, and the process and transfer of energy and nutrients, and that algae is going to add oxygen to the body of water. And the dissolved oxygen levels will have a certain level which will dictate the health of the ecosystem. Dissolved oxygen is the amount of oxygen dissolved within a body of water, and it's measured in milligrams per liter. Now, the two main sources of how to get the DO, or dissolved oxygen, into the body of water is through diffusion from the atmosphere and through photosynthesis from plants like algae that are present in the body of water. However, this is a dynamic system, therefore the amount of dissolved oxygen can fluctuate based on various factors that occur in nature. Now, there are 6 main areas or factors that will change the DO amount within that body of water. That is water temperature, water depth, water salinity, the amount or number of organic matter within that body of water, the atmospheric conditions like the wind, strength, direction, and the weather conditions on a daily basis, or even the climate over a longer period of time. And then you've got the elevation and altitude. So basically the position of that body of water can dictate the amount of DO. So all these factors contribute to a change in the dissolved oxygen amount within that body of water. The first factor that will control the amount of DO or dissolved oxygen within a body of water or an aquatic environment is the temperature of the water itself. Now this is an inverse relationship. So pretty much the warmer the temperature, the lower the DO. So the colder the water, the higher the DO. Now this is because the temperature of the water affects the ability for oxygen to diffuse and move into that body of water. So the increased heat of the water would increase kinetic energy and therefore produce a more favorable condition for the oxygen to be removed, to escape. The oxygen will escape from that water if it gets warmer due to the energy and the movement of the water molecules themselves. So ideally, a temperature between 0 and 10 degrees Celsius, which is pretty cold, would be the ideal temperature for a high dissolved oxygen content or value, between 11 to 14 milligrams per liter. If the water gets warmer, so above 19 degrees, that ability to hold dissolved oxygen goes down to 8 to 10 milligrams per liter. If it's above 22 degrees Celsius, which is quite warm, which you get sometimes in the months of the summer in various rivers and ponds and lakes, that dissolved oxygen would decrease again further below 8 milligrams per liter, which would then bring it towards a more hypoxic, which is around 2 to 4 milligrams per liter, and then an anoxic condition, which means that there is very little to no dissolved oxygen, around 0 to 1, in that marine environment. And this would severely impact the ability for that body of water to support any organic life, as they need and require that dissolved oxygen. Another factor that affects or controls the amount of dissolved oxygen in a body of water is the depth of the water. Now this works in 3 parts. The first part is as you go deeper into that body of water away from the surface, you are receiving less sunlight, or the sunlight can't penetrate as deep into the water beyond the surface. And this creates less photosynthesis. This creates a decreased production of oxygen from that photosynthesis, and therefore you have less dissolved oxygen present in the body of water. The next part is the weight of the water. As you're deeper, more water is above you, pushing down through gravity, and the spaces and voids in between the water molecules that could potentially hold dissolved oxygen, which is called gas saturation, that space or void is being squeezed into a smaller and smaller size or volume, and that equates to every meter of depth you increase, there will be a 10% reduction or decrease in dissolved oxygen capacity. The third part is the organisms. So along the floor or the benthic environments of that body of water, it could be an ocean, lake, or river, you get less dissolved oxygen because the oxygen is being used for respiration by these benthic organisms and decomposers that live in the bottom areas, zones of this body of water, and any dissolved oxygen that makes it down to that depth will be used for these organisms for respiration. A body of water can be fresh water, it could be brackish water, it could be brine, and it also could be saline or salty water like in the oceans, whereby the salinity refers to the amount of dissolved ions inside or dissolved in the water, such as chlorine, sodium, magnesium, calcium, potassium, and this would take up space within the water chemically and leave less space, less voids and cavities for any dissolved oxygen. So if you have a higher salinity body of water, it would hold significantly less amount of dissolved oxygen because there's not enough space for that dissolved oxygen to take up because it's been taken up by the dissolved ions. So less space overall. So salt water actually holds up to 20% less dissolved oxygen than fresh water. So the relationship is higher salinity, the less dissolved oxygen you'll find in that body of water. The next limiting factor is organic matter, or OM, which is going to affect the amount of dissolved oxygen in that body of water. Now this is a balance. This is a delicate balance because you need a certain level of dissolved oxygen for this environment to have life, to support life. So you can't have a hypoxic or anoxic conditions in that body of water because it won't sustain life. You need at least 6 milligrams per liters up to 8 or even 10 or even higher into 14 to get a very fruitful and vast organic life in that body of water. However, the more life you do have, it will eventually decompose. And when it decomposes, you'll have these microorganisms and bacteria that will consume the dead and decaying detritus and organic matter that's going to be in this body of water, a lake, a river, even an ocean. And those microorganisms are going to themselves use oxygen that's available either in the middle part, the surface, or usually at the benthic regions or zones, and that will lower the dissolved oxygen in the body of water. So it's a delicate balance where you need oxygen to support life, but the life is going to eventually decay, and there's a tipping point, a threshold, where there is too much dead and decaying material and the bacteria is using the oxygen versus a healthy ecosystem. Another factor that can control dissolved oxygen within a body of water, a lake, a river, stream, an ocean, is the weather conditions, the wind, and also I've added here the stage or type of river that we're looking at in particular. So the river's location and part of the river system can play a big role in the amount of dissolved oxygen. So a more turbulent flow, which you find in the headwaters and even the middle section of the river, the course of the river, with a steeper gradient, with a discharge going over uneven riverbed, which causes turbulent flow and rapids, that would mix up the water and greatly increase the amount of diffusion of oxygen within the river itself. Then a more laminar, more stagnant, more calmer rivers in the lower course would have a lower dissolved oxygen due to the lack of diffusion between the atmosphere and the ocean. So then you get the weather conditions, which includes the wind. The wind plays an important role because the wind can move over the surface of the water and create friction, waves, and a level of mixing between the surface and the increased depths. This will increase the dissolved oxygen levels, which causes an increase in gas saturation, increase in oxygenation, and with depth, the wind can even stir up and create mixing of that water column, which would then increase dissolved oxygen further. Factor number 6 that can have an effect on the amount of dissolved oxygen in a body of water is the elevation or the altitude. In this case, more appropriately, the elevation. So the height of the surface above sea level. So anything on land above sea level in terms of mountains or plateaus, or by the coastline with a river delta or an estuary, or even an ocean at sea level. So this barometric pressure, which comes from the elevation, how close you are to sea level, you will have an increase in atmospheric pressure compared to a higher elevation, perhaps on a peak of a mountain where the source of the river occurs, or a mountain lake perhaps. The higher the elevation, generally the lower the dissolved oxygen, because there is less pressure asserted on the atmosphere pushing down onto that lake or stream or body of water, which would lower the diffusion rate from the atmosphere to the body of water, to the lake or river. So just from the decreased atmospheric pressure, you're going to have less dissolved oxygen entering the water. Now we know the definition for dissolved oxygen, the sources of how dissolved oxygen gets into a body of water, and the different factors that control the amount of dissolved oxygen in a body of water. We can establish a tolerance range for the biotic, the organic life forms that require dissolved oxygen in a body of water to survive, to support life. So you have this range from 0, which is termed anoxic, which means the lack of oxygen. Then you have a hypoxic environment where you have a very small amount of dissolved oxygen between 0 and 2 milligrams per liter, and this is generally going to be an anaerobic environment where organisms have evolved to not rely on oxygen for their main source of energy and life. And an environment, a lake, river, a stream, or an estuary or ocean that has anything below 4 milligrams per liter, looking at a environment that has limited life. Ecosystems and food webs find it difficult to survive in this kind of environment. Then you have a stressed environment, which means that there's a spectrum or a continuum of the amount of dissolved oxygen that can support life. Now, the lowest would be 5 or 6 milligrams per liters, and then up to a more healthier 10 to 11 milligrams per liter of dissolved oxygen. This would provide a much better environment, habitat, and source of oxygen for an array of animals. Now, certain animals have evolved to live in environments with lower DO, versus some fish and animals have no tolerance for that and only survive in a higher DO amount, which is 10 or 11. So then you get an environment with plentiful dissolved oxygen, so anything above 12 to 13, 14 plus, all the way up to around 26 milligrams per liter, which would be termed supersaturated, which means there's a lot more oxygen kind of pushed into the water than the water can really hold. It's beyond 100%, and you have just an excess of DO. And in that case, you might have dissolved oxygen flowing or diffusing from the water back into the atmosphere. But these areas are great to support life, and a lot of these marine or aquatic organisms flourish in a higher dissolved oxygen environment above 12 milligrams per liter. Here we have just a graph illustrating the relationship between DO and the amount of life that can be supported within a body of water. And as I said before, the more DO in an environment, generally you have the higher amount of organic life because it is supported by the dissolved oxygen within the body of water, be it a lake, river, stream, estuary. The more DO, the more life. This is the Earth Science Classroom. Thanks for watching the video. If you liked it, please subscribe, like, and share. And if you want more content and videos on Earth Science, please check out my channel.